Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Research Collaboration Conference webinar, where we'll be discussing what is next for R&D on aviation's Jet Zero flight path. Just a quick note before we get started that this session is being recorded, so feel free to share far and wide to your colleagues once we're done with the session. So I'm your host, George Koudis, and today I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr. Steve Altus, who is a technical fellow and portfolio strategist in digital solutions analytics for Boeing Global Services, Dr. Adam Durant, who is the founder and CEO of SATAVIA, and Dr. Marc Stettler, who is a senior lecturer at Imperial College London. So today we're going to be discussing some of the collaborative research that NATS is part of, alongside our partners from industry and academia, and how this contributes towards aviation's Jet Zero strategy. So reducing aviation's environmental impact and saving fuel is very important to us here at NATS. We have and continue to implement smarter and more responsible ways to do this, enabling savings of over 8 billion tons of CO2 emissions since 2007. NATS welcomes the global commitment of our industry to reaching net zero by 2050, and we have pledged to fully support the commitment to achieve net zero carbon emissions by that time. Investment in our people and new technologies, including modernizing our airspace, will make flying more efficient, providing even greater CO2 reductions, and ensuring that aviation can continue to connect people and goods in a sustainable way for future years and future generations. So, on to introductions. As I mentioned, my name is George Koudis, and I'm a technical lead in the research and development team here at NATS, where I'm responsible for coordinating our environmental research. Prior to joining NATS, I received a PhD from Imperial College London, where I investigated local air quality impacts at airports, and I then went on to work in aviation consultancy before returning to research a few years ago with NATS. So I'll now move on to our speakers and ask them to give us a brief introduction to themselves and how they got into this field. So Steve, could I start with you, please?
Yeah, thanks very much, George, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So as George said, I currently work as a technical fellow in portfolio strategy for digital solutions and analytics. And part of my role is to see how aircraft operators' needs are evolving with the changes in the world, whether they're driven by emerging technology or whether they have social, economic, or political influences. I'm based in San Jose, California, so Silicon Valley, and I'm pretty sure being here in this environment influences a lot of my own thinking on technology and on how you get value from technology that changes everyday life. And also how partnerships are key to progress. I've been with Boeing for 24 years. Before that, I got a PhD in aircraft design optimization at Stanford. And my former research group went on to do a lot of the early work, at least that I'm aware of, in studying aircraft design and aircraft operations for reduced environmental impact, looking explicitly across multiple factors rather than only minimizing fuel use. At the time, I was working as a technical strategist in flight planning software for Boeing, and I took some of their methods and looked at what happens when you put them into that operationally used software. Now, around that same time, in 2008, actually, I got involved in work on air traffic management with the International Civil Aviation Organization, which most people know as ICAO. And the panel I support works on new data exchanges and procedures to enable more efficient flight paths. ICAO had published this global air traffic management operational concept, and we knew that the way flight plans were filed wouldn't fully support the vision that was in the concept. We've made a lot of advances in this area, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this some today, because I really believe this is a key to improving aircraft operational efficiency and impact. So if you put all together all my background, my education, interests, and work experience, it won't surprise you that I'm really glad to see sustainability getting the broad interest it's getting now across our industry, not just in specialized areas, but across all the stakeholders. And I'm just really glad to be here today. I'd like to thank George and NATS for the invitation to be a part of this discussion, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Thanks, Steve. That's brilliant. Adam, could I ask you to give a brief introduction of yourself as well, please?
Yeah, hello everybody. My name's Adam Durant, and I'm founder and chief executive of SATAVIA. So we're a software and data analytics company based in Cambridge, and we're doing lots of things to hopefully make aviation smarter and greener. But I started off as a scientist, so I have a PhD in geology actually, but specialised in volcanic clouds. So I know a thing or two about volcanic ash, which at the point at which I got my PhD, I thought was a fairly niche subject. And I actually ended up moving back to the UK. I moved back to Bristol. I worked with various climate research groups at the time. So scientists in 2009 were collectively receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. So I was working alongside those people in Bristol, trying to understand kind of the influences and forcings on climate. So that's where I kind of started my journey in climate science. I then moved to Cambridge and I started working in a lab there with small sensor technology measuring carbon emissions. But it was about 2 weeks into that job, I pretty much decided to abandon volcanic ash. And then that volcano in Iceland with a very long name, Eyjafjallajökull, erupted. And I found myself doing two jobs. So I ended up getting involved in a spin out of NILU, the Norwegian Institute for Air Research, in Oslo. Subsequently moved there and worked with a startup that was working alongside Airbus and EasyJet on volcanic ash detection. So I ended up spending quite a bit of time working with Airbus Flight Test in Toulouse. We did quite a few flights testing this piece of experimental imaging hardware that would enable pilots to discriminate volcanic ash clouds from water clouds and hopefully fly around them and not into them. I learned an awful lot through that experience about the challenges of innovating in aerospace and aviation, especially if you have a hardware-focused solution. But it did provide the inspiration for me to go off and found my own company, SATAVIA, back in the end of 2013, and made a conscious decision to focus more on data analytics and basically productizing the best available science and bringing that to the aviation industry to hopefully help solve some of its greatest challenges. So pre-COVID, we were really focused more on how the environment damages aircraft, causes deterioration. So we've done a lot of work with the major OEMs. But one of the positives about COVID is that it's really helped focus the industry on sustainability. So we recently completed a project funded by the ATI called DISA, where we developed some capability to forecast and analyze high altitude ice crystal icing conditions. And on the back of that, now we've started looking at contrails. So delighted to be here today. Yeah, and thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks, Adam. And last but not that list, Marc.
Hi, everyone. So thanks, George, and thanks, Nat, for the invitation. Yeah, so I'm a senior lecturer at Imperial College London in the Centre for Transport Studies. And I lead a research group of about 10 people, PhDs and postdocs, who are motivated to reduce the environmental impacts of our transport systems. And one of the key areas is aviation. That's the field in which I did my PhD, completed back in 2013, and did a lot of work on aircraft emissions of soot particles. And the extension to that is understanding how those soot particles affect contrail formation. And that's kind of led into our research over a few years on contrails. So prior to completing my PhD, I did an undergrad degree in physics at the University of Durham. And then I moved to Cambridge for an MPhil in engineering for sustainable development. I stayed in Cambridge for my PhD, and then a couple of years of postdoc after my PhD, and then moved to Imperial in 2015. And I guess, here we're talking here about aviation's climate impacts, and we will get onto the topic of CO2 versus non-CO2 impacts. But last year we published a paper where we showed that actually these non-CO2 impacts are pretty important. and we were looking at the contrail impacts of flights in the Japanese airspace. And there's two key messages that came out of that piece of research. And the first was that not all contrails are created equal, and some flights have a very significant contrail climate impact, and other flights don't have any impact at all. And the second key message is that if we want to do something about contrail impacts from flying, it doesn't necessarily have to cost us fuel. So one of the big concerns is that doing something to reduce contrail impacts will necessarily increase fuel consumption, and that is obviously bad because it would increase CO2 emissions. But that's not necessarily the case. So we're continuing to work with NATS, and we're doing an evaluation of the North Atlantic and so the North Atlantic airspace, and we're really pushing ahead with our research in that area, and thankful for the collaboration with NATS.
Brilliant. Thank you all. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'm looking forward to a really interesting discussion, which we already started to touch upon some of those topics just now. So really looking forward to today's session. For everyone joining us, please submit your questions for our speakers and for myself over the next 30 minutes or so, and we'll try to cover as many as we can at the end of the session. So how I'd like to start today's webinar is what I'm sure we can all agree is the big question really at the moment, which is how the aviation industry can meet the various net zero climate impact pledges that we've committed to. So what do you think are the biggest challenges, and what can we do across industry, across tech, and across academia to begin to address those challenges? So Steve, perhaps I could start with you to give a bit of an industry view and industry perspective, and any specific examples that you'd like to touch upon.
No, thanks. So you probably know that Boeing released a sustainability report in July of this year. And the point I want to make about that is it's really broadly scoped, and we're looking really at the full life cycle of aircraft, not just their operations. So how do we design them, build them, what happens when they're removed from service? And that includes the design process itself, the materials used all the way from the paint on the outside to the materials in the cabin and everything in between, and the sourcing of those materials across our supply chain. And it also includes our manufacturing sites where in fact we've already exceeded a lot of the goals we had set for 2025. But I know here we want to talk more about operating the airplanes. There's a lot of exciting new technology in the pipeline, both evolutionary in terms of improving the efficiency of the aircraft you see flying around now. Also, of course, more revolutionary changes, especially in propulsion technology. And to help get this improved technology into operation, we support ways to accelerate fleet renewal, and again, to do that sustainably in terms of end of life for aircraft. But again, that obviously is on a longer time frame. So we're working hard on what we can do with operations of existing aircraft. Sustainable aviation fuel is very attractive because it doesn't require changes to the aircraft themselves up to certain proportions, or to the operating procedures or the information exchanges. But we are also looking at improving procedures to fly more efficient paths, both in the terminal area and en route, and especially how we can be more flexible in modifying those paths based on changes in the operating environment. So like the weather can change, the traffic, the availability of certain blocks of airspace, or the details of the aircraft that's operating a specific flight. And one thing that's a key with these efforts is their partnerships with air traffic management service providers like NATS. So we look at how we can validate more efficient procedures on the micro level, for example, for an individual airport, but also work at the global level to help define new concepts like trajectory-based operations. And beyond helping develop those new concepts, we work with individual ATM service providers to elaborate the details they need to implement the new procedures and the new technology, and to continue validating them all the way towards development. So one of the concepts that we're advancing is a new way to exchange flight plan information. And this stems from the ICAO work that I mentioned before in my bio, where it's more of a two-way iterative exchange. and we can update the plan with all the information both the ATM service providers and the operators have about the flight, and even make more changes after departure with the latest information. So we have better planning. We have the ability to update it if it turns out things weren't what we expected when we planned. And then we're gathering a tremendous amount of data off the airplanes themselves and from the ground systems. So we can use post-flight and real-time analytics to improve both the planning and the execution. And we're building into both our flight planning systems and our onboard systems new functionality to take advantage of these improved information exchanges and to find those more efficient paths now that we can more reliably execute on them once we find them. And this is where we can start looking at a wide variety of different objectives and constraints. So if we wanted to, for example, consider contrail predictions in the decision of our flight path, which, I mean, if you've listened to just the introductions, you know this is going to be a big topic of discussion today. We can make plans that take uncertainty into account. We can change the plans based on real-time information about the evolving conditions, and we can analyze what really happens so we can build confidence in those predictions. And I'm with Marc that it's great when we can not burn more fuel. But if we have to look into the question of burning a little more fuel to avoid some of the more persistent contrails, we want to have a high probability of getting enough benefit in return. So we want to have the confidence in those predictions that comes from that post-flight analytics. So I've gone down from the big picture of everything we're doing to some of the details of how we can partner with the service providers, and I think we'll be talking more about these even more as we continue the discussion.
Great, thanks, Steve. Yeah, completely. You touched us upon some really interesting points there that they will definitely come back to towards the end, certainly around collaboration and how we can work more closely together as partners going forward. So yeah, thank you for that. Adam, can I come to you next, just to give us a bit of a view, your perspective, perhaps from a tech industry point of view?
Yes, certainly. So yeah, as I mentioned, we're an SME based in Cambridge, so we're just over 20 people, but we've brought together a team of really diverse and talented people that covers everything from data science and AI, software engineering, aerospace engineering, and atmosphere and climate science. So all of that's encapsulated in the software we build, and it would follow that we would be able to then apply that to many problems in the industry and quickly help solve and deliver value across a whole range of use cases. But I guess some of the key things I'd like to talk about really are the process of innovation in the industry, technology readiness timescales, science uncertainty versus actually taking some action, and the specific non-CO2 issue that we're talking about. So on the first point, process of innovation. So we have done our very best to try and quickly work with industry partners, find software solutions to things. So we've been in programs like Hangar 51, which is an international airlines group program. So we were paired with Iberia maintenance there, and we did some sort of advanced data analytics and AI to try and get better predictions of engine deterioration and predicting what components or unserviceable components might be found unexpectedly in engines that come in for a major overhaul. So we certainly can prove the concept fairly quickly, but then there's the whole process then of actually productizing that and taking it through technology readiness and certification. And that process can take 6 to 10 years. So some of those, or maybe it's faster in other cases, but you know, there are very long timescales involved in doing the process of innovation and getting these new ideas, new technology to market and bring some value. We've also recently completed a 3-month engagement with Aviation X Lab based in Dubai. So this is a Dubai-based incubator. It's got the backing of Airbus, GE, Collins, Thales, and Emirates. And again, we found another use case. It was contrails and non-CO2 climate impact. It gave us complete access to the organizations, to the best people in these organizations. We made some progress in demonstrating that we could actually do flight planning to avoid contrails. But then we came up against some of the classic sort of human barriers that you might find. So How you incentivize people in these organizations is critical to being able to start innovating and doing things differently. So for example, if you take the case of contrail avoidance, some people say the science is uncertain, or we don't know enough, we're not certain about it, and there could be some fuel burn penalties. And so if your flight ops team is only focused on fuel burn penalties, they're going to be incredibly reluctant to try flying new trajectories that might increase the fuel burn. So we've got to find a way of being able to innovate and quickly get through technology readiness, not cutting any corners, but having a clear sort of roadmap for how these new innovations can be actually then brought into the operational environment. Of course, it will evolve a phased sort of scaling approach to it. So those are sort of the key sort of points. And then on the subject of science uncertainty, science is inherently full of uncertainty, but you have to live with it. And the fact that we are happy to step on a plane and it flies, and we're comfortable that we will reach our destination, there's still uncertainty involved in that process today. So certainly on the issue of climate change, I think we really have to be accelerating some of the action on various issues. Non-CO2 is probably the elephant in the room. We're getting some indications that this actually could be quite a considerable problem, the scale of the forcing. It's certainly been recognised by the IPCC now, and so we should already be proactively thinking about how we can start collaborating and solving the issues. So that's going to involve collaboration across all aspects of aviation. So yeah, I guess those are some of the key points. And then there's a pretty high cost of a barrier to entry. So for a small company like mine, I've managed to build partnerships with the likes of Microsoft, Amazon. We've raised quite a lot of grant funding from places like the European Space Agency, the Aerospace Technology Institute, Innovate UK. We've also convinced some investors to back us. So all the time we're kind of, if you like, taking calculated risks with that resource as to what we're going to build and which problems we're going to try and solve, because ultimately we've got to build a commercially sustainable solution, as well as it being something that's going to help the sustainability of aviation. So yeah, those are my kind of thoughts on the issues.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, completely agree. Speed is of the essence. Maybe not something that the aviation industry have done particularly well over the years, but climate change is a problem of today. Marc, can I come to you now? Can you maybe give us a bit of an insight into the perspective of academia? Your take.
Yeah, I think going back to your original question, George, which is what are the challenges associated with net zero climate impact from aviation? I think the challenges are huge. Globally, we're forecasted to have growth in air travel over the coming decades. That's notwithstanding the effect of COVID over the last few years, 18 months. So we've got this growth in air travel, and we do have more efficient planes today than we did, say 10 years ago. We also have opportunities to minimize fuel consumption on flights by having more efficient routing. But those aren't going to get us to net zero or to zero if we are burning jet fuel, conventional jet fuel. So ultimately, we're going to need serious ramp up in sustainable aviation fuels in order to tackle life cycle CO2 emissions. So both from biofuel sources and synthetic fuel pathways, where the carbon to produce a fuel is taken out of the atmosphere through something called direct air capture. But the amount of energy you need for that is just astounding. I mean, some back of the envelope calculations for the UK, just using the UK's jet fuel consumption, we'd need something like an extra 32 gigawatts of electricity generating capacity. So it is a huge challenge. I think there are some promising signs, but I don't want to understate the challenge in order to get aviation down to net zero. I mean, we say net zero, and what that means is that anything we can't reduce to zero, we offset. And that there are some issues around offsetting of carbon emissions, and not only kind of ethical questions about whether we should allow flying to offset, flying to continue to emit and buy credits from other sectors, but also, I think there's questions around some of those offsetting schemes and whether they're all as efficient or as effective as each other. So that's kind of the CO2 view, but I think aviation is a very distinct sector in that it has this very significant non-CO2 climate impact, and that is different to a lot of other most other sectors where by far and away the dominant greenhouse gas is carbon dioxide. So that's both a challenge and an opportunity, I think, for the aviation industry to realize that it does have a significant non-CO2 impact, because I think historically it's been a burden, which is that the aviation industry has sort of thought that if that's recognized, then it has to do more, as it were, than other sectors. But actually, I think it's potentially an opportunity, because those non-CO2 impacts are, I wouldn't say easier to solve, but there are opportunities to reduce them perhaps more quickly than we can reduce CO2 impacts of flying.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you so much. And that leads me nicely into the second question today. So you've all touched upon non-CO2 and specifically contrails and the impact that contrails can have on climate change. I'm just wondering if you could explain a little bit more about this. So we're often told, as you mentioned, that CO2 reduction is the biggest way that we can solve climate change. Do we know enough about contrails and contrail formation to test the principles now of contrail avoidance? So maybe, Marc, if I could come to you first, perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about the science behind contrail formation and the mechanism by which this contributes to climate change.
Yeah, so I mentioned that aviation is distinct from other sectors in that it has this very significant non-CO2 climate effect. And our best estimate of the climate effect of aviation today is that about 50% of that is due to, about 2/3 of that is due to non-CO2 forcing agents, and predominantly that's contrails and contrail cirrus and nitrogen oxide emissions, or NOx, and the dominant effect is due to contrails and contrail cirrus. So what are contrails? Well, they are the word contrail is short for condensation trail, and they are the visible streaks that you sometimes see behind aircraft that are flying in the sky. So they happen at cruise altitude. They don't happen at airports. You won't see them at the airport, or if you do see some mist behind an aircraft wing, that's something else. But what a contrail is, it's water vapor that's in the atmosphere and in the plume of the aircraft engine, condensing onto soot particles, and then because it's cold up at cruise altitudes, those water droplets freeze and form ice particles. And then depending on the atmospheric conditions, those ice particles can either survive and grow, or they can sublimate, and that's when you see the contrail disappear. So sometimes you will look up in the sky and you'll see a contrail that sort of doesn't seem to be attached to a flight, and that's the situation where the contrail has persisted. And over time, that contrail can spread out to cover quite significant areas of the sky, and that means that it can have quite a significant impact on the Earth's radiation balance. So that's the amount of incoming sunlight and the amount of outgoing heat. So an individual contrail can have a cooling effect because it reflects incoming sunlight, but it can also have and it also has a warming effect by blocking outgoing heat that would otherwise have been lost to space. Overall, global average, we think that contrails and contrail cirrus have this warming effect, but individual flights and individual contrails that they might form can have either a cooling or a warming effect. So I think the key point is that we don't treat all flights and all contrails the same. If we did, and if we use such as a multiplier on the CO2 emissions, and treat everything, all flights, the same, what that means is we don't have any incentive to reduce contrail impact. So we do need to recognize as a starting point that the contrail impacts of flying are not equal. And that then gets into the detail of, well, how do we predict when a contrail will form? And it is very complicated and depends on many factors, but that's something that we're applying ourselves to.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mark. That's a really helpful overview. Adam, perhaps I can come to you next. So your company, SATAVIA, uses real cutting-edge computing to model the atmospheric processes that Mark has just described and to try and predict those. So could you tell us a little bit more about the role that data and tech and your company can play in helping us address this clearly very important area?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess in a nutshell, we're trying to productize the best science available, put it in software, and then apply that to the problem of contrail avoidance. So just winding back ever so slightly, I've come at this also from having a background in cloud microphysics. So I actually came from a lab at Michigan Tech where I did my PhD, which was focused on what causes little ice crystals to form. And I've also recently started hiring out of that lab as well. So I'm not only building a team of people that can do software development, but we also are trying to bring some of the best scientists within the same group of people. So we got this interdisciplinary crossover. But I guess the biggest challenge is around scaling that science up to the scale of aircraft movements, which is global scale, truly global scale. And then being able to simulate those cloud processes at an incredibly fine scale so that you get an accurate result. So we've got extreme, scales here. So you have to go from the absolute micro scale. These little ice crystals that form in contrails are finer than 10 microns. There's enough of them that they affect the heat coming up from the surface of the Earth and the sunlight coming into the atmosphere. So we have to be able to effectively model vertical profiles of clouds, both natural clouds and man-made clouds from aircraft, and then ultimately look at the net change in how that energy is moving around the atmosphere. And that's fundamentally what we need to turn into software that then creates data analytics that informs decision making. So one of the greatest challenges we've had, first of all, was productizing the science. So we're using some science grade models that typically run on science supercompute. We've had to work with commercial infrastructure providers like Microsoft and Amazon to make those work at scale. That in itself was a huge challenge. And then making the models work at global scale while keeping the cost down as much as possible. But the beauty of it is once we've built that, which we have, we can then start processing data at scale. So we've got all global aircraft movement data for many years now stored in our platform. So we've gone back actually and looked, for example, at one of the operators we've worked closely with. We've analysed 30,000 flights and found that they spent 30% of those flights spent longer than 10 minutes in contrail forming conditions. So we're starting to get some actual quantitative data on the scale of the problem, which can then also lead to building the right solutions for that. So I'd say it's an interesting time because the cost of high performance compute has also come down. It's really available now. And that's really enabled us to build this technology. So I think it's timing. Science is there. I think we're at a place now where we can actually tangibly offer a technical solution to this for the industry.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you very much. And that leads me quite nicely into the question for Steve, which is, clearly this is an important challenge for the aviation industry. From your point of view as an industry, what can we do to tackle this? Why would the aviation industry want this added headache of contrail avoidance? What's in it, and what can we do to improve?
Yeah, I mean, I'll answer the last part first. Why it's important for industry, and it's pretty simple. We know that people all over, individuals and businesses, are increasingly taking environmental factors into their decisions, all their decisions, including making decisions on how they move people and goods. And so, like whether you fly somewhere or where you fly. And whenever I'm out talking about more efficient flight paths, I do get asked about contrails. There's certainly awareness. And I think that's largely related to the attention that folks like Marc and Adam have brought to this topic. So lots of interest, and that's one of the drivers. Now, as far as what we can do to include contrail avoidance in the decision process, I want to talk about sort of the state of the art in flight route optimization. We hear all the time about how there's so much more automation in the world and how we're moving towards all sorts of automation, but the best decisions in most fields now are still being made by a human working with computers. So the computers are evaluating options for them and giving them information about different scenarios and how they compare in different metrics. And one reason this is effective is that sometimes a large variation in your flight path, in the case of flight route optimization, sometimes a large variation in your flight path is only a small difference in the fuel required. But other times a small variation in your path can have a big increase in fuel. So with contrail avoidance, rather than trying to constrain every flight path optimization to avoid a certain level or duration or impact of contrails, if we can generate multiple scenarios and then let those flight planning experts at airlines evaluate them based on multiple factors, taking the fuel and the time and the projected emissions and the predicted contrail formation into account, and not just are there contrails, but what impact will those contrails have with their persistence, the time of day, the cloud cover, all those factors. They can use these flight planners, their expertise, and the airline's operational goals and constraints for that particular flight to decide the best thing to do with that flight. And again, the ability to change the plan post-departure with these emerging information exchanges and operational procedures, it really helps us to be more confident about those plans in case things develop differently. It gives us sort of a safety net to know to act confidently, knowing that if things evolve differently, we can change the plan.
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks so much for that answer. I'd like to just go in a slightly different direction now and talk about the collaborative actions that are really needed to make all of the science and the tech that we've just spoke about, those actions become a reality. So Marc, research is obviously going to play a vital role going forward. We talk about a lot about scientific certainty around this. So what support does academia need, and what can academia do in that collaborative space?
Yeah, I definitely think that academia has a role to support industry, to make sure that the best available science is being given to the industry, that it's sort of validated, it's peer reviewed, and supported by the evidence. So I think there's a crucial role for academia there. Regarding contrail avoidance, we do need technology, we need models, we need data streams, and we do need collaboration across industry and between industry and academia. And it all does cost money. There is an associated investment required to do that. So I think my take on it is that we need some, and Steve mentioned actually that there is evidence now that people are taking climate change concerns into their decision making, and that's clearly happening in certain parts of the world. I think there's less strong evidence on whether that actually changes their behavior, but I think there needs to be some clear signal that the contrail impact of aviation needs to be addressed, and that either has to come from a government taking leadership or some policy organization, or the industry itself taking leadership. But there needs to be that incentive to push through some of these advances that we do need, but are ready to go. And to support the industry to reduce its climate impact. So that's my main message. I think we need some leadership and recognition that this is a really significant climate problem, and yeah, there needs to be some commitment and investment put up to support it.
Thanks, Mark. So, Adam, if I can come to you next, from a regulatory governance perspective that Mark touched upon, how do you think things can or should change in the future to push us towards tackling non-CO2 effects of aviation? And a big question about how we should represent aviation non-CO2 emissions in terms of those global climate targets that we spoke about earlier.
Yeah, great question. I guess starting from the last point there, I guess ultimately, once we're confident enough that we can measure, quantify the magnitude of the effect of contrails, it follows that they should, logically become part of a nation's emissions inventory, potentially. But taking a few steps back, how the regulation has evolved. Well, there's been decades of science research on contrails. It's really been led, I think, by organisations like DLR, the Greener by Design group, and the Royal Aero NATS. DLR set up the first working group on contrails in 2016. We saw the first paper on the non-CO2 impacts come out of EASA earlier this year, laying the framework to sort of bring them into CORSIA. So the industry is already taking action on this, and the regulation could be coming shortly. All the signs are there. What should we do now? Well, perhaps this is an opportunity for the industry to take some proactive action on this. So today we don't have to do anything. So that gives us some time to start proving out technologies and our ability to quantify, analyze, and then put in place the technical solution without having to do it reactively, in response to regulation appearing on the subject. And furthermore, I think the operators and any stakeholders need some kind of incentive to do this. There are potential penalties, but as Mark said, with a bit of intelligent management, decision making around which flights to target, possibly those costs can be kept to a net zero extra fuel burn cost. But we're working on a method that would enable operators to claim carbon credits. So there's a lot of greenwashing going on. We're certainly not trying to create anything that doesn't have any sound basis in science. It's a multi-year process that we have to go through to do this, and there's a lot of external review and committees that we have to go through, and then we have to work with industry stakeholders to prove, validate the method. But we're hoping that we'll be able to offer this method that would then enable us to quantify the climate impact of not forming, well, the climate impact prevented by not forming contrails on a flight-by-flight basis, and convert that into a carbon dioxide equivalent that the operator then could put towards their offsetting of direct emissions, for example. So that's one idea that may help to incentivize some of the stakeholders to take some action on this. And of course, it can be done in a controlled, phased way so that we don't run before we walk.
Brilliant. Thanks, Adam. Steve, it's coming to you. I know you're a big advocate of the benefit that collaboration can bring in this space. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, perhaps about technology. And I'm interested as well whether there's any difference in the North American perspective on this as well.
Yeah. So regarding technology, one thing we're really trying to move toward, not just in this area, but more broadly, is taking uncertainty into account across all of our planning. So for example, if we think just about the wind optimal path for minimum fuel, forecasts have gotten much better, but they're not perfect. So we want to look at not just the best path, assuming the winds will be exactly the same as the forecast, but we look at multiple paths across different possible variations in the actual winds. And we find the overall best solution, given that we don't know exactly what the winds will be. And we're looking at a lot of other factors to apply that same approach to. And I really can see contrail avoidance as another opportunity to apply that same approach. Related to that, again, in technology, but on a broader scope, there's been such an explosion in data availability and in the analytics technology to process all that data and figure out what it means to every individual actor in terms of decision advice. So when I talked before about a human decision maker with tools that tell them what's happening and what we think will happen, and maybe what they should do about it. Remember, these are people in different roles with different problems to solve and different improvements to contribute. And we need to pick out the information that's relevant to all of them and present it to them in a way that they understand and trust so that they can confidently act on that information, even when it's not what they expect based on their experience. And that's a challenge, but it's one where there's been really a lot of exciting progress in general in the field of analytics and artificial intelligence. Let's see. So as far as a North American perspective, I'm not really sure I should speak for an entire continent, but I will say this about what I see happening in the U.S. The people in the U.S., and I'm not talking about activists or politicians, I mean generally across the population, and this is something Marc said on a global scale, and it's also happening in the U.S. People broadly support climate action. And I don't know if that's specifically what's influencing companies, but every single day I get news items brought to me about companies talking about serious sustainability efforts, right? Not greenwashing, but doing real stuff, real action. So I think the drivers of action might be different, but I see a lot of positive activity across our industry and many others as well. So I don't think, you know, I think the end result is certainly consistent from North America to Europe.
Brilliant. Cool. Thank you very much. And just on the collaborative piece, I know there's been some really interesting work already taking place with ourselves and partners. So it's a real watch this space. I look forward to seeing what we can do together. It's so important. Yeah, again, thank you. So that covers the main areas for today. And I know we're running a little bit short on time, but there has been an interesting question popped in the chat, which I'd like to just touch upon. So Robert sent this in. Thank you. The environmental impact of aviation rightly gets a lot of attention. But what about the potential safety impact of climate change on aviation? Assuming enough damage has been done to change the atmosphere globally, aviation may also need to mitigate the impacts of that. Things like flying higher or new aircraft configurations, better forecasting. Steve, maybe I could start with you on that one, if you've got a view, and then maybe Marc, if there's anything that you'd like to add afterwards.
Yeah, so I mean, the aircraft right now fly all over the world in a very wide variety of different conditions. So everywhere and all seasons. And so the variation in atmospheric conditions that they already encounter is immense. And the forecasting has gotten very, very, very much better, as I mentioned a moment ago. So the forecasting is better. The aircraft are tested, designed to fly in a wide variety, and the local variation in weather is huge compared to the change. You know, even a fast change in climate. So I don't think this is an area of special concern for us with the aircraft.
Cool, thank you. Adam, Marc, anything to add on that one?
I think you know, climate change is going to affect extreme weather conditions, and that might be extreme heat, it might be thunderstorms, and so yes, the aviation industry will have to adapt to those, and it might cause greater disruption. It might constrain some of these things that we've been talking about, optimized flight paths and you know, and various other things. But yeah, that I think yes is the answer to that. Aviation will have to adapt, and it may be that climate change and extreme weather causes more significant disruptions in the future.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add that you know, as long as we can predict the conditions, then we should be able to manage any increased threats from you know, extreme weather or whatever it is. So I guess it all points towards continuing to invest in the best science models, observation, and continuously improving that through collaboration between industry and academia.
Thank you all. So I'm afraid we've run over a little bit. That's about all we've got time for. I know we could have kept kept talking and talking about this topic, and I'm sure we will do in future. Anything we didn't get around to answering in the chat, we will come back to, and we'll make sure that we do put answers. And please continue to check out the virtual exhibition. It's still open for another week and a bit. So please do get in touch with us through that avenue. Thank you everyone who's joined us today to watch. As I said, the session's been recorded, so please feel free to share it far and wide. And I hope that you found the conversation as interesting as I have today. If you've got any other feedback for us or any ideas for future work, or if you want to discuss what you're working on with us or how we can collaborate, then please contact us through the virtual exhibition, or send us an email at researchanddevelopment@nats.co.uk. One last thanks to the panelists today. Thank you so much for your time, and thanks for joining us in the interesting discussion. And yeah, thank you to you for joining, and goodbye.